Next, I want to talk about the colonial period in South America. And in a previous lecture, we highlighted the Spanish Empire, but it was we had a little part that was Portuguese as well. And so one thing I want you to know about is something called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And this goes back, way back to the, about 1500. I'll just round that off. And during this time, both the Spanish and the Portuguese had really developed their sailing technology. The Portuguese initially, and then later the Spanish, and were really making their way out into the world to look for new trade routes with other parts of the world, especially trade routes to Asia. And each one had a different approach. That the Spanish had this kind of, you may have kind of heard the story, Christopher Columbus had this bold approach where they thought, well, they'll just keep sailing west and then eventually hit Asia. Maybe not really realizing there's another whole kind of set of continents in between there. And where the Portuguese were exploring around Africa. Right? So, however, the two were in conflict, and so they came up with a way to kind of split up their kind of where they were exploring and trying to, lay claim to. And this Treaty of Tordesillas made a dividing line where the things on the one side would be part of the Spanish zones and the things on the other side would be the Portuguese zone. And so the Portuguese zone was to include Africa, and the Spanish one to mostly include the Americas. However, one thing that did get kind of lopped off there is that part of South America landed in this Portuguese zone because of this treaty, which had that kind of fairly arbitrary dividing line. And that's where we have the Portuguese colony of Brazil. So again, Treaty of Tordesillas, this is an agreement between Spain and Portugal, and it really divided up part of the Americas as far as which colonial power was going to be, have more right to lay claim to it. And so one thing unique about Brazil is that Brazil is very uniquely Portuguese, where a lot of other parts of Latin America are very Spanish. So, they speak Portuguese, that's part of their history. So this is looking at the colonial situation in the 1790s, Spanish Empire back here in red. Then you have the big Portuguese colony. So initially they had the coastal areas and they expanded inward over time. And then above there, you also had a few other ones. You had the Dutch, the French, and the British had some colonies up there as well that we'll look at. They're called the Guyanas. They don't have that many, they're actually, they don't have that many people who live there. They're mostly kind of strips along the coast. Now, one thing that the Portuguese were heavily involved with, especially with their explorations around Africa, was the transatlantic slave trade. And we know that much about this from art history, but if you look at the number of people who were brought to different parts of the Americas, this is the thicker the line, the more people. So this is the amount of people that were brought to British North America. And one thing I want to contrast that with is how many people went into the Caribbean, massive amount to the French Caribbean, especially Haiti, British Caribbean. And then the biggest of all was the amount of people brought to Brazil. And one reason for that is because the Portuguese, were, bringing people from Africa to work on in slavery, to work on plantations in this new colony of Brazil. Other countries were involved in the transatlantic slave trade as well. So plantations from Brazil up into the Caribbean, where there was a much higher amount of people brought in slavery there than there was to British North America. So, well, we kind of know this from our own history in the United States. This really extends even further into South America. And it's part of their cultural geography today that along these coastal areas where you had plantations, you still have a strong presence of African descendants, people of African descent, because of the high amount of people who were brought in slavery at one time. Some people, and there are some places where people were brought into slavery and then escaped and developed their own communities in the mountains in these areas. But essentially, this green area along the coast, you have a strong presence of people of African descent. And in fact, Brazil itself has South America's largest Black population, which kind of makes sense because of that pattern we saw in the slave trade. So this is showing that cultural region. This is showing where you had plantations, especially in sort of north and eastern Brazil. And you can also see that in some of the economics of Brazil, that the north and the east are still areas where you have concentrations of poverty. And that has kind of driven people from this area into some of the more urban areas like Sao Paulo. Now, we also have a large indigenous presence, that South America has a very large indigenous population, mostly concentrated in this area called the Andean West in Peru and Bolivia especially. There's also, it's not as densely populated, but there is a strong indigenous presence in the Amazon basin as well, including some people mentioned that there's actually indigenous people who are out of contact with the outside world. And they're aware of the outside world, they just don't. I think that they, because historically that their ancestors have had so much problems, with Spanish, whoever, decided to kind of keep to themselves. They're aware of the outside world, they just don't want to deal with them. Now, one thing I'll highlight here is that there is this other category called mestizo. And so you have African, indigenous, and then kind of in between there, there's this kind of more general category called mestizo. And mestizo is a Spanish word from the colonial period, which was used to identify people of mixed heritage, both indigenous and European. The Spanish had a whole set of terminology that they used to describe people. Unlike the British, the Spanish were had much more of intermarrying and relationships between the Spanish or the Portuguese and people of indigenous background, but they had this terminology that they used to talk about the offspring or their children. And so mestizo has a specific meaning, but generally we just kind of use that to mean people who have, kind of this mixed heritage. And in the Southern Cone, this is the more European part of South America. We talked about how the climate down there is different. It's a little bit more like North America or Europe. So you had a much more influx of people from European countries who settled in these places and to farm, and especially farming, people growing, different kinds of crops like grapes and other things. So Argentina, Uruguay, Chile over here, and the southern part of Brazil. So we talked about, if you look at South America, you have the tropical zone up here and the middle latitudes, which has a climate that is a little bit more in line with Europe, North America. So a lot of people, during the Industrial Revolution, Europe's population really swelled, and a lot of people, made their way into other parts of the world, including North America, United States especially, but also into the southern part of South America. And one concept I want to highlight here is the concept of cultural pluralism, that you have a high diversity of different kinds of groups in South America, and they don't have necessarily a concept always of a melting pot, like we would maybe the theoretical thing we talked about in the United States, where everybody just kind of melts into one group. But what you do have is collections of different people who live with each other, and they don't necessarily mix with each other, but they live amongst each other. So, for example, if you look at the megacity of Sao Paulo, it's right at the confluence of European, African, and mestizo cultures. And so you have people of all different backgrounds who kind of live together in the urban area in their own kind of different neighborhoods.